Murdered, a podcast. I'm your host, AB. And this week on Mama Murdered, a podcast, we're talking about an unsolved case that's a little bit different than what we would normally cover. But this story has had me in a chokehold since I was just a little tiny girl watching this story air on the old Unsolved Mysteries episodes that I would watch with my mom's best friend. So this week, we're talking about the 3 men who managed to escape the unescapable Alcatraz federal prison. Now, even though this case is technically unsolved, I personally don't believe it is, and I'll say that with my whole chest. I think these men made their great escape, and I think that they lived out the rest of their lives without getting so much as a traffic ticket. And of course, we'll talk about some of those reasons why I think these men didn't die during the escape, and we'll get into that in further detail as we go on with the escape plan. Also, Patreon members, be on the lookout for a new bite-sized episode coming to you Friday. I've been working super hard to make sure to get these episodes up and ready for you, along with the episodes for the main feed. So we should be getting back on track with that too. But with all that out of the way and without further ado, let's get it. Now, of course, before we go right into the backgrounds of these 3 men, we first need to learn a few things about the history of Alcatraz and why it was believed to be escape-proof to begin with. Because yes, this prison was hyped up and sold as an escape-proof prison. And we'll also need a little bit more context as to where this prison is geographically, because that's important. Because Alcatraz prison sits right in the middle of Alcatraz Island, and Alcatraz Island is just a teeny tiny small island right off of the shore of the San Francisco Bay in California. The island is about 1.25 miles from the shoreline of San Francisco Bay, and the island was originally developed for military fortification along with a military prison and a lighthouse in the mid-19th century. So this wasn't even originally supposed to be a federal prison. It was used as a military prison all the way up until 1934, when it was then converted over to be used as a federal prison. Which, that was just a little fun fact that I didn't know about the prison until I started looking further into this case. But then come to find out, I didn't actually know as much as I thought about this case until I started looking into it to do this episode. Because when I tell you my jaw has been on the floor for the last week while I researched this case, that is not even an exaggeration. I guess I never realized how crafty and how resourceful these 3 men had actually been in order to pull this escape off. But let's get back to it before I accidentally drop a spoiler alert or something on y'all. So in 1934, the military prison on Alcatraz Island was switched out to house the hardest and baddest criminals in the U.S., and it was transformed into this federal prison. The name was then listed as Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, and with this now being a federal prison, that also meant that taxpayers of the United States would hold the responsibility of paying to keep this prison up and running every day. And one thing to know about Alcatraz is it costed an ungodly amount of money to keep this prison up and running every day. It's reported that it costed approximately $10.10 per inmate per day. Other prisons at the time were spending roughly $3 per inmate per day. That is a massive difference in cost to keep a prison up and running. But that's not the topic of discussion here. Alcatraz was pretty commonly referred to as the Rock, and was used as a place to keep prisoners that other prisons just couldn't control. And since Alcatraz was supposed to be escape-proof, a lot of times Alcatraz would get prisoners who either had attempted to escape other prisons before, or prisoners who were known for completing escapes from any other prisons. There were some men who were sent to Alcatraz after escaping multiple other prisons. So we know that Alcatraz prison sits on a huge rock on an island off the shore of the San Francisco Bay, which means that this prison sat on this huge rock that was just surrounded by this cold, frigid waters of the San Francisco Bay. So between the water temperatures and the fact that it would take more than 1 mile to get from Alcatraz to the shore of the San Francisco Bay, along with the fog and the fact that guards were trained to shoot and kill during escapes, it truly was believed that Alcatraz was escape-proof. And after reading the punishments and disciplinary actions that were used, I can also see why so many people did try their hand at escaping Alcatraz. And it wasn't even really physical punishments, because honestly, I didn't see much in the way of physical punishments being used. besides the typical, shady things that you would still find happening today in prisons. This was more along the lines of mental punishment that I saw, which, depending on who you ask and how you look at it, mental could be worse than physical. For example, there was a rule that was established that was only used for 4 or 5 years before it was deemed too harsh of a punishment. And this was a rule that was implemented that said that prisoners weren't allowed to even talk. So, for the majority of the day and night, the prison would just sit in complete silence. The prisoners couldn't talk to each other, they couldn't talk to the guards, but hell, they couldn't even talk to themselves if they wanted to. They were only allowed to talk openly while they were in the exercise yard, while they were at work, or on the weekends. Inmates eventually got so desperate for just human interaction that the prisoners who didn't have a job would empty the water from their toilets and then use the sewage pipes to be able to talk to one another. And like I said, eventually this rule seemed to be doing more harm than good, which is when it was decided that inmates could talk freely amongst themselves again. And not following the rules at Alcatraz, even the no talking rule, wasn't really an option, because the punishments were just as harsh as the rules themselves. Some of the punishments were being locked in your cell and losing your privileges, like being able to attend a movie showing that the prison did twice a month. Other things that could be taken away as punishment included yard time. So the little bit of time a day that the inmates could go play basketball, cards, dice games, exercise, etc. And then new inmates were kept in a quarantine status where they were just left for the first 30 days. They weren't allowed to go outside or even participate in recreation times. And inmates who tried to go on hunger strikes would be force-fed with a rubber tube that would be stuck down into their throats, and then it would be a mixture of eggs, milk, and sugar that would be poured down those tubes and into their throats. There was also a place that was referred to as the dungeon that was used on Alcatraz for inmates from time to time, and this was obviously a dungeon underneath the prison where the inmates would have to stand in complete darkness and then be chained in the standing position where they were given little to no food and they would be beaten pretty regularly. Inmates could be kept in this dungeon for as long as 2 weeks. This didn't last long though either, because it was eventually also deemed too harsh of a punishment in 1942. Inmates who couldn't be kept in the general public were sent to D Block, which was also known as the Hole. The cells in D Block were made up of nothing more than a hole in the ground to be used as a toilet, and each of the 40-something cells in D Block varied in different ways, kind of depending on how serious and severe the punishment was. For instance, there was a cell in D Block called the strip cell, where inmates would be stripped down completely naked, and of course they would be put into a standard D Block cell with the hole in the floor for the toilet. And then the inmates who were sent to the strip cell were given a thin mattress, but they were only able to have this mattress during lights out. So as soon as the morning hits, the mattresses would be pulled from their cells. And typically inmates weren't able to be kept in the strip cells for longer than 2 weeks, but legally the prison wasn't allowed to use the strip cell for longer than 19 days. The inmates in all of D Block, however, weren't fed regularly, and they were subject to multiple different types of sensory deprivation, along with, again, pretty regular beatings. But to kind of set off this harsh punishment and strict daily routines, Alcatraz did have some things that were considered more luxurious things, especially when being compared to other U.S. prisons at the time. But even these nicer things were merely a disguise for tighter security. For instance, each inmate had their own cell. They didn't have a cellmate to share their space or toilet with. Now, granted, the cells at Alcatraz were smaller than other, standard-sized prison cells. The cells at Alcatraz were 9 foot long by 5 foot wide, and they stood 7 foot high. Now, I know that having a cellmate helps pass the time because it's somebody that you can talk to, play cards with, whatever. But I've always thought it was a little bit weird, such a weird idea, to just, put a couple of hardened, possibly violent criminals into a small, cramped space together and just kind of cross your fingers that some shit doesn't pop off. So each inmate had their own cell at Alcatraz, and this was a way for the prison to cut back on violence that would happen during the night. Now, another thing that Alcatraz had that many other prisons didn't have and still don't have even in 2025 was decent quality food. The warden at the time figured that men with full bellies weren't as angry or even hangry, which is true. So Alcatraz would serve decent food, and the inmates were allowed to eat as many servings as they wanted. Now, another thing that Alcatraz had that other prisons didn't have was hot showers. The water wasn't as hot as what inmates would have liked, but they weren't having to take cold showers either. Though they still had to shower together in this, big shower room. And of course, they weren't using any nice native body wash or anything crazy, but the waters in the showers weren't freezing cold like they were at other prisons. And the reason as to why inmates were given hot showers is kind of funny and a little bit dumb. It's because it was believed that if inmates didn't get used to taking freezing cold showers, that they wouldn't be able to train their bodies to be able to handle the frigid temperatures of the water that surrounded the island that Alcatraz prison sat on. So essentially a group of what I'm presuming would have had to have been men got together and they were like, if we give them warm showers, then they'll never make it across the freezing water that surrounds the outside of the prison, which means they'll never be able to escape. And they probably drank a shot of whiskey and clapped for themselves. But people quite literally swim those same exact waters in those same exact temperatures and even colder temperatures than that for funsies all the time in marathons now. And I would be willing to bet good money that those people that, swim those marathons in those same cold waters now still go home and take a pretty hot shower. But this was the reason behind the warm showers. And shockingly, Alcatraz was one of the only prisons to have a pretty good guard-to-inmate ratio. There were 3 inmates to every 1 guard, which seems a lot more reasonable than some other inmate-to-guard ratios that I've seen. Now, with having this many guards to inmates, it wasn't hard to keep up with head counts of every inmate. Head counts were done every 15 minutes throughout the day without fail, and every 30 minutes to an hour at night. But rest assured that the head counts were done like clockwork. Guards at Alcatraz also did random cell checks daily, and the fence that surrounded the prison was topped with barbed wire. So Alcatraz was pretty state-of-the-art for its time, and like I mentioned before, its whole purpose was to house inmates who other prisons either couldn't handle, or inmates who had a track record for either making escapes or attempting escapes at other prisons. And I'll say it again for the people in the back who weren't listening the first 3 times I said it, Alcatraz has been coined as escape-proof at this time, which only makes this story of a few underdogs who potentially made it out alive all the better. So, since its whole purpose was to house inmates that were either escape artists or inmates who other prisons couldn't handle, let's go over a few of the people that were housed in Alcatraz during its time operating as a federal prison. Alcatraz housed Robert Stroud, who was commonly referred to as the Birdman of Alcatraz, which I guess is why I always assumed that he had birds as pets or something while he was at Alcatraz, but he didn't. Well, not while he was incarcerated at Alcatraz, he didn't. But before he was transferred to Alcatraz, he had been incarcerated at the Leavenworth Penitentiary in Kansas, where he had been allowed to have, keep, and even sell birds. And this all started because Robert Stroud proved to be such a violent prisoner that he had to be moved to solitary confinement during his time at Leavenworth Prison, where he stabbed a guard to death while everybody watched, which sadly didn't come as a shock because Robert Stroud had been arrested for manslaughter, assault, and even first-degree murder. Now, after he stabbed and killed a guard, he was sent to solitary confinement where he found a nest of 3 injured birds. And this started his love of birds. And the Leavenworth prison even allowed Stroud to house upwards of a few hundred birds in a cell close by to his own cell in solitary confinement. So that's how he got his name, Robert the Birdman Stroud. But when he was moved from Leavenworth Penitentiary to Alcatraz Federal Prison in December of 1942, he hadn't been allowed to take or keep any of his birds after being transferred to Alcatraz. And I guess that was my little history lesson on why I strongly assumed that the Birdman of Alcatraz kept birds while he was there. Like I said, I thought I knew a lot more about Alcatraz than I did once I started this research. And now that we're way off track, let's keep going. Because Alcatraz also housed some pretty other notable names, along with people like Machine Gun Kelly, and no, not the mediocre celebrity that you're thinking of from today. This Machine Gun Kelly was an actual badass who earned the rights to his name when he and his third wife, I believe it was his third wife, They kidnapped and held a well-known and wealthy oil tycoon for ransom after being caught using the money from a ransom while they were on the run. So they got caught using the money from the ransom that they had gotten when they kidnapped this, oil tycoon, and that's how they got caught. Other big-time names that were housed at Alcatraz were Floyd Hamilton, who spent some time on the road with the notorious Bonnie and Clyde, and none other than the Chicago gangster Al Capone. Which, also a little side note about Al Capone, he actually started a band during his time at Alcatraz, because at most other prisons that he was kept in, he was able to pay off the guards and the prison staff, and he had a lot of the things that other prisoners weren't allowed to have. But once Al Capone got to Alcatraz, his money was basically useless, because, the guards and staff at Alcatraz didn't accept his bribes, and he was treated just like any other inmate. So, to keep himself sane after being treated like a regular inmate, he used all of that gangster money and he bought himself some musical instruments and started himself a band that he called the Rock Islanders, which is clever because Alcatraz is nicknamed the Rock and it's on a literal island, so the Rock Islanders play in their band on the Rock, which is on the island. Again, points for being so clever. But aside from the mob bosses and the gangsters that were housed at Alcatraz, there were also a couple of just average Joes who couldn't help from at least attempting to escape from every other prison they were ever housed in. And, since Alcatraz had been deemed escape-proof, those same escape artists were sent there. So let's finally go over some information about our main players in this case. And we have quite a few. There'll be 3 or 4 main players. So, the 3 men that we're going to start off this show with who allegedly died during the escape attempt, and then the 4th man who was supposed to go with the 3 men but just didn't make it out. So, let's start off with the brains of the operation, Frank Morris. He was born in Washington, D.C., and he was later abandoned by his parents and forced to kind of fend for himself when he was just 11 years old. And being that his parents had abandoned him at the ripe old age at just 11, Frank was in and out of the foster care system and the criminal justice system. By the time Frank was in his late teens, he had been arrested for things like armed robbery and possession of narcotics, breaking and entering, unlawful flight, and being a runaway. I think probably the saddest part of Frank Morris's story is that he was well above your average level of intelligence. Out of the whole general population at the time, Frank Morris's IQ was in the top 2% of the population, with an IQ of 133. And we'll later learn that Frank definitely used his high IQ to his advantage during his escape from Alcatraz. He had served time in Florida and also in Georgia, and he managed to escape from Louisiana State Prison while he was serving a 10-year sentence there for bank robbery. After this escape, Frank was able to avoid police capture for over a year after he'd escaped from the Louisiana prison before he was captured and caught during a burglary. And it was after this escape that Frank was transferred to Alcatraz Island to serve out the rest of his 14-year sentence. Frank arrived at Alcatraz in January of 1960, and he was given the inmate number AZ1441. Now, the next 2 players that I want to introduce you to in this case are actually brothers. John and Clarence Anglin. They were only about a year apart in age, and they came from a super large family where they had 14 other siblings. John and Clarence Anglin were extremely close in age, and their siblings reported that they were also super close to one another. So if you saw one brother, then the other brother was surely not far behind, and they did nearly everything together, including the crimes that they committed. Now, as teenagers, the Anglin brothers started robbing banks and other stores and businesses together in the early 50s. And if you really sit down and think about it, robbing banks was just kind of like the thing to do at the time. People were so desperate for money and even more desperate to keep their families fed, clothed, and sheltered. And the Anglin brothers did rob banks, and they robbed other stores, but they never did this with violence. The brothers would specifically target stores and businesses while they were closed that they would rob. And they would do this so that no one would be inside while they were robbing the place. And according to some of the family members of the Anglin brothers, John and Clarence had only ever used a weapon one time during a robbery, and the brothers hadn't even used a real weapon then. They had used a toy gun to ensure that no one would actually get hurt. It was more of a scare tactic, and even then, during the bank robbery, where they used the toy gun to rob the bank manager passed out or fainted during the robbery, and John and Clarence actually stopped what they were doing, checked on the bank manager, gave him a drink of water, and made sure that he was okay before they escaped with the money that they'd stolen. And I don't know, it could just be me and the fact that I love a good underdog story, but to me, these just sound like a lot of desperate men in a lot of desperate situations who did some bad things so that they could help provide for their families. But that could just be me, so let's keep going. Now, after robbing a bank in Alabama, the Anglin brothers both received 35-year sentences. John and Clarence served some of their time in a Florida state prison, and then they were switched to an Atlanta state prison. But the brothers just couldn't help themselves from trying to escape from each and every prison that they were sent to, which is also how they ended up on the Rock, aka Alcatraz prison. John arrived at Alcatraz first in October of 1960, and Clarence followed soon after, and he arrived in Alcatraz in January of 1961. Now, despite the warnings from previous prison wardens about John and Clarence's multiple different escape attempts together, the warden at Alcatraz must have been a real family man because he decided to disregard every warning that he was given, and he allowed the Anglin brothers to share cells that were side by side. Now, the last and final player in this whole great escape was a man by the name of Allen West. Allen West had made his arrival at Alcatraz prison in June of 1958. After serving at Alcatraz, though, Allen West had a reputation of kind of being an arrogant ass. He was serving his second term at Alcatraz Island. So let me set a scene for you. John and Clarence Anglin were given cells that were essentially right next door to one another. Because remember, every inmate at Alcatraz has their own cell. So the Anglin brothers are cell block neighbors, and Frank Morris and Allen West had just randomly been given adjacent cells to one another. And just to make this one big happy reunion, Frank Morris and John and Clarence Anglin had all known each other from before, where they were housed in other prisons before Alcatraz. Because Frank and the Anglin brothers had actually served time together in Atlanta State Prison before they'd been sent to Alcatraz at different times. Now, rumor has it that Frank Morris was the brains of the operation, which I kind of believe because of his IQ. And it's also believed that West was brought in on this escape plan because he had access to a lot of different things that the men were going to need in order to be able to get out of Alcatraz. Because like most prisoners, some of the inmates at Alcatraz had a job, and Allen West just so happened to have the perfect job. He was a maintenance man. And as Allen West worked the maintenance job, it made it to where he had access to all sorts of different parts of the prison. And Allen had been in charge of painting when he stumbled across a vent shaft that seemed vulnerable. And that one vulnerable vent shaft set off a chain of events that would lead to one of America's greatest prison escapes. Now, this escape plan would start to form a life of its own in December of 1961, and it was set to include inmates Frank Morris, John and Clarence Anglin, and Allen West himself escaping the unescapable Alcatraz prison. Since Allen West was on maintenance duty, he was able to find a couple of old saw blades while he was out cleaning an old maintenance closet out. And these saws would be used to chip away at the concrete around the vents in each cell. Since all four men were housed so closely together, they could keep an eye out for each other and keep each other informed on the progress being made or setbacks that might arise. All four of the men were housed in cell block B, and this would be vital to their escape plan. But the men weren't just going to jump at the first chance that they saw to escape. This plan would be meticulously planned and thought out and would take place over the course of a year before they would actually go through with it. Behind some of the cells in cell block B, the men discovered a slew of different pipes that ran throughout the prison and into a maintenance closet that was rarely ever used. And if the men could make it into this trail of pipes, the men figured that they could climb through the 3 stories it would take to get to the top of the cell blocks. After they could get to the top of the cell blocks, the plan was that the men would then be able to access the roof using a ventilation shaft. And if they could make it to the roof, then the men would make it off of the cell house and into the water that surrounded Alcatraz prison. And then if, by some miracle, the men could at least make it to the water, the plan was that the men would use some sort of flotation device, maybe like a raft. But this seemed like a lot of ifs and maybes and what ifs and probablys for this plan to actually work. So how did they manage it? Well, let's get into it. So for starters, the first step to this plan was to be able to get into that maintenance closet that was rarely ever used. So in order to do that, the men had to dig out a big enough space to be able to shimmy through this vent that was in every cell. The men were able to figure out a way to remove the vent covers off of the walls, and they would use these things that they'd found or stolen from around the prison as a means to dig a hole and make this hole big enough for their bodies to be able to fit through. They would use things like stolen spoons from the chow hall or pieces of metal or saws that Alan West found during his shifts as a maintenance worker. And there was roughly 7 to 8 inches of concrete holding these vents and vent covers into place. And while they did use spoons and saws to dig these vents out, Alan West had also figured out how to make power tools that the men could use. Now, at one point, a vacuum cleaner was broken, and Alan West was put in charge of trying to fix it when he noticed that this particular vacuum ran off of 2 motors. So he figured if he could get the vacuum working only using 1 motor, then he could use the other motor to make like a makeshift drill or tool of some kind, which is exactly what he did. He wired the vacuum up and he figured out how to get it going with only 1 motor. And then he used the second motor that he'd snuck back into his cell to make a drill. And you've got to be asking yourself the same exact questions that I was asking myself while I was reading more into this case. If these men are using power tools in their cells and passing power tools back and forth and chipping away at concrete surrounding these vents in their cells, then how the hell did nobody hear what was happening? Well, like I mentioned, musical instruments were allowed inside of Alcatraz prison. So every night after dinner, all of the inmates would go back to their cells, and the guys who played musical instruments were given like an hour and a half each night to play their music together from their own respective cells. And these little escape artists would wait until that hour or hour and a half, of what that was allotted for music. That's when they would start their drilling and chipping away at the concrete. And the musicians were allowed to play and practice their instruments every single night. So this would at least give the inmates an hour or more each day to work at chipping away at the concrete to make those vent holes big enough for the men to be able to squeeze their bodies through. But musical evenings weren't the only times that the men were able to work freely because there was also construction being done around each cell block, and that would obviously get pretty noisy too. But this was going to be no small task. It took these men months to finally chip away at the concrete and to be able to get the holes behind the vents covers big enough for the men to be able to actively get their bodies into. And I'm sure by now you're probably wondering how none of these guards realized that there were these monstrous man-sized holes, behind each vent covers. But these inmates thought of literally everything, because they'd just taken regular old cardboard and used the paint that Alan West had been able to sneak from his job as a maintenance man. The men were then able to use that paint to paint the cardboard covers to match the paint that was already on the walls of their cell. So they would just stick those pieces of cardboard back up to cover the holes. And they had cut out this cardboard to look exactly like the vent covers that they had been removing. So imagine you just pull off this metal vent cover, there's this small tiny hole for air to come through, and you chip away at it 7 to 8 inches deep, and then all you're using to cover it up is a piece of cardboard that you cut out to look like the vent cover. That's crazy. I'll post all these pictures on social media because you're going to want to see them, I promise. And all 4 of these men were just leaving their cells at all hours of the day and night to go through these holes and work on the rest of their escape. But of course, not all 4 of the men could leave their cells at one time. 1 or 2 men would go through their holes in the walls behind the cardboard vent covers, and the rest of the men would kind of stand watch at the entrance of their cells and be on the lookout for guards coming. That way the men who had stayed behind to be on the lookout could warn the men who had gone through the holes to let them know if somebody was coming. And if they signaled to the men that, had gone through the holes that somebody was coming, those guys would hurry up and get back inside, scurry back through their holes, cover their vent covers back up with their cardboard covers, and be back in their cells before anybody ever realized that anything happened. But even leaving their cells, I think they only did this at night while everybody else was asleep. Because remember, all the guards and staff who work at this prison also live on this island. So things were a lot less lax at night, just so nobody was interrupting the staff and their families that lived on the islands. Head counts and cell checks weren't done as frequently through the night either, but it's kind of crazy because damn near every inmate who was in Alcatraz at the time that this escape plan was being planned and executed, they all knew about the escape. So all of the other inmates knew that Frank, John, Clarence, and Alan were trying to escape and that they were planning it. And they would even go so far as to help these men get things that they needed to make the escape or to help with the planning so they could get out sooner. So essentially this whole prison is just working together to get these 4 men out. And unlike any person that you'll find in 2025, nobody spoke a word about it. No one snitched, and everyone kind of silently cheered, hoping that these men, in their plans, that everything would work out. Loyalty may be dead now, but it wasn't dead back then. Now, we all know by this point in the timeline that these 4 escapees had managed to get the holes in their cells behind the vents big enough so that they could actually get through them. And the men were leaving their cells every chance they got to go work on the next step of their escape plan. And the next step that they needed to figure out was how to get across the water surrounding the island once they were able to get through the vent and through the maze of pipes and outside and into the actual water. Because all 4 men knew that swimming just wasn't an option. And maybe they could have swam and made it across, but they'd still have to worry about the guards seeing them, and swimming across the San Francisco shores is not going to be a short process. And then they would also have to hope that the guards didn't see them and shoot on sight. Because these men weren't stupid, and they knew that in the 29 years that Alcatraz had been open and operating as a federal prison, 36 men had tried their hand at escaping. Funnily enough, 2 out of those 36 men actually had tried to escape Alcatraz twice. And out of all of those 23 attempts, all the men had been caught by guards during the escape. 6 of those men who had tried to escape were either killed by guards during their attempts or drowned. So swimming just did not seem like their best option, but they would need to get crafty. And just like that, a mechanical magazine from the prison library handed these men the perfect idea. They could build a raft. The magazine detailed how to make an inflatable raft and also how to make life jackets. So the men got to work. They would use a prison-issued raincoats to construct this inflatable raft. The guards that were on duty in the mornings when the inmates would start their day at work weren't the same guards that were there at night when it was time for the inmates to leave and finish their workday. So on days that it rained, the inmates would purposely not wear a raincoat to their jobs, and then they would get one out of the maintenance closet. And I'm sure that sometimes they grabbed more than one raincoat to put on at a time, just for the purposes of taking more than they needed for the raft. But then the guards who were on the shift when the inmates' workday was over, they never knew that the men hadn't worn their own raincoats that morning when they'd started their workday. So this was kind of genius. But for 4 grown men, you would need a pretty decent-sized raft. And how the hell are they supposed to hide a raft that big? Well, on top of a cell block, of course. Except there was only one problem with the idea of constructing the raft out of rain jackets on top of their cell blocks. And that was that the cell block was actually in perfect view of one of the guard stations, which sounds insane, because it is. So Alan West actually had to go to the top of their cell blocks while he was working maintenance. And he purposely made a mess with the paint, the concrete dust, and whatever else he was doing. And he did this for a reason. He purposely made this huge mess so that he could convince the guards that they needed to let him hang up anywhere from 50 to 80 blankets to keep the paint and concrete dust from making a mess all over the rest of the workspace. And surprisingly, that worked. The guards were actually like, well, I guess that's fine as long as we get everything cleaned back up once you're done. Because it's actually a good enough reason without sounding suspicious. Why would you need 50 or 80 blankets to hang up? Besides the fact that you're trying to keep out the mess. I mean, it makes enough sense to where they wouldn't ask questions. And those 50 to 80 blankets hid this massive raft that these 4 men were building out of raincoats. And you're probably thinking like, okay, sure, blankets being hung up for a week or 2 doesn't seem that crazy. But y'all, these blankets were up for months while these 4 inmates built piece by piece a raft to float right off of that damn island with. And then once it got time for the last head count before lights out, the men would be in their cells, they would do their head count, and then the lights would go out. After that, they would shimmy their way through the hole that they dug out of, behind the cardboard vent covers, and they would climb through those pipes and up and into their workspace behind those blankets. And they did this every single night for months. Now, obviously, the guards were still doing head counts at night, while the inmates were asleep, but as long as the guards could see, like, some portion of your hair, skin, body, something, they weren't going to wake you up. They would just mark you as accounted for and move on to the next cell. But all 4 of these men were in their cells most nights, so they'd actually taken concrete dust, flesh-colored paint, soap, and toilet paper, and they'd constructed their very own papier-mâché fake heads. And these fake heads were so real that the guards never, not one time, questioned them during the middle of the night for head counts for months. And when I say that nearly every other inmate knew that these 4 men were planning to escape, I mean that in the most serious way. Like years after the escape, one of the inmates who was at Alcatraz during the escape plan said that he was actually the person who taught Frank Morris how to mix the paint to make it the flesh color so that men could match their skin tones to make those papier-mâché heads. And you absolutely have to go see the pictures that go along with this case, because these papier-mâché heads looked extremely detailed. They had facial hair including eyebrows, eyelashes, and even full heads of hair to match what the inmates actually looked like at the time. They had ears, and they were so detailed that they were passed off as real for months. Clarence Anglin actually worked in the barbershop at the prison, which is how the men were able to get just like handfuls of real human hair. And this just shows how much thought and detail and planning went into planning this escape. These men had all of these different things that they needed to remember, and all these different things that they needed to happen at exactly the right time and exactly the right place. And even with all of this other planning and thought that went into this plan, they still thought about the fact that they were going to need a fake papier-mâché head so that they weren't missing head counts at night. And they would eventually use those same papier-mâché heads to get a massive head start after the escape was executed. And it worked. It worked perfectly. But I'm trying not to skip ahead. So now they have somewhere to build this makeshift raft, and they have all the materials that they'll need to make it work. So what do the men do? They build not only 1 but 2 rafts. You heard me, 2 rafts. One of the rafts was the raft that the men planned to use as part of their escape route, and it was much larger than the other one. And then as far as the second, smaller raft goes, I'm not sure if they built it just for shits and giggles to see if they could, or if they built it as like a backup plan just in case they got separated. But you'll see why I asked that question here shortly. So the first, much bigger raft was 14 foot by 6 feet. I want you to really stop and think about how big 14 foot is. I'm 5 foot 2 inches tall. That raft it would be massive. 14 foot, that's double the height of me and then some. Like, this is insane. And I couldn't find an exact number as to how many raincoats and stuff that they used to make this raft. But I would imagine that a lot of raincoats were missing from the prison after this raft was assembled and after they realized these men had escaped. Now, Alan West had mainly been the one in charge of building this raft piece by piece and taking each piece as it was finished to the top of the cell block. He could then assemble it, all the smaller pieces to make this one massive raft. And again, they were able to do all of this without much worry since their workspace was hidden behind a bunch of blankets that the guards knew about and were okay with. Of course, the guards didn't know they were sneaking out of their cells every night, but that's not the point. Now, after weeks of assembling these raincoats and pieces together to make this raft, the men were ready to try their hand at escaping the non-escapable Alcatraz Island. Now, at this time, the warden and his family had been gone from Alcatraz Island on vacation, so the prison had like a stand-in warden to watch over things. But even this stand-in warden and his family lived on Alcatraz Island too, so I don't know if maybe this stand-in warden's job was like actually something else and he just stepped in the warden's shoes when he needed to, like when the warden had to be away. Either way, this was really bad luck for this guy because on June 11th, 1962, it was finally time to put this years-long plan into motion. At about 9:30 p.m., after the lights went off inside of Alcatraz prison, Frank Morris, John and Clarence Anglin, and Alan West all propped up their papier-mâché dummy heads in their bed and tucked their fake bodies to sleep. By the time the guards noticed that they were missing the next morning, the men hoped to be on a beach somewhere sipping on a cold one. After propping their fake heads up in bed, the men removed the cardboard vent covers and climbed through the narrow opening that they had been working on for months. They pulled the cardboard vent covers back over to cover the holes so that, if the guards checked through the middle of the night, they weren't raising any suspicions. Their papier-mâché heads were in bed and their vent covers were on. Now, the men scrambled through the pipes and up to the top of the cell block where Frank Norris and the Anglin brothers met up to finish carrying out the escape plan. But remember, Alan West was supposed to be escaping with them. But once everybody made it to the top of the cell block where they'd planned to meet up, Alan West wasn't there. And as it turns out, like I mentioned, Alan West had been, kind of the main man in charge of building the raft. So he had never actually gone through the hole in his cell behind the cardboard vent cover. He had dug his hole out just like the other three men, but he had never actually gone through his hole, whereas the other three men were having to shimmy their way through the holes behind that cardboard vent cover almost nightly. So while Alan West had made this big hole, big enough for him to squeeze through, he hadn't actually, been able to map out the pipes. He thought he'd be able to get to the top of the cell block, which had been coined as the meeting spot. But he wasn't able to. And at this point, the men had come this far and, it was just going to have to kind of be every man for himself. The other three men were forced to leave Alan West behind. It is kind of messed up, though, because this whole escape plan was supposedly Alan West's idea. And then he was just so focused on every other detail of the plan that he missed this very crucial step. But the show must go on. So Frank and the Anglin brothers were climbing through the bars, to get onto the cell block of the prison. The other inmates could hear the three men scurrying around, and they were all just silently cheering them on. But at one point, all of the other inmates who were listening said that they heard what sounded like one of the men dropping a bar or something onto metal pipes. And that they said that they don't know how the guards did not hear this loud, clinking sound. And some people speculate that maybe the guards had been paid off to look the other way. But I personally don't know how much I believe that, because if Al Capone and all of his money couldn't bribe these guards, then I highly doubt these lower class, impoverished people who rob banks to get by would be able to, bribe the guards into looking the other way during this escape. But that is just my train of thought. Let me know what you think. But it did make some of the other inmates question it, though, because all the inmates kind of said the same thing. They said that once you get used to being in that prison, you kind of learn the sounds and where they come from and what sounds make what noises. And a lot of the inmates say that there were a lot of new noises happening on the night of the escape. And that none of the guards ever batted an eye, which is weird. But what would any of these guards really, stand to gain from helping these men escape? It doesn't make sense. But I would also be willing to bet that those guards, also wouldn't really expecting some outlaw petty bank robbers to be escaping an unescapable prison, and especially not with a massive 14-foot by 6-foot raft. So maybe they did look the other way because it's supposedly not possible. Now, once the three men made it onto the top of the cell blocks where the raft was hidden behind the blankets, they had a few different finishing touches that they had to do to the raft. They finished those things up, and they, tried to kind of wait to see if Alan West would be able to actually make it and show up. But by the time the three men finished with the last few things on the raft, Alan West still hadn't made it out of his cell. And the men knew that they were just going to have to leave him behind. The men had to jimmy those bars from the top of the cell blocks because just beyond those bars was the roof of the prison. They were somehow able to get those bars broken loose, and they'd been able to get themselves and their massive raft up on top of the roof successfully. And once they made it to the roof of the prison, the inmates inside of the prison still said that they could hear the men running across the roof of the prison, which again would have had to have been another weird sound that the guards completely ignored. And the men running across the roof of this prison actually scared off hundreds of seagulls that landed on top of the prison roof every night, and the inmates inside later reported being able to hear what sounded like hundreds of seagulls making all kind of racket outside the prison. Once the men made it across the roof, they had to make their way down 5 stories of the prison, where they were then met with 2 different 8-foot-tall fences, both being wrapped with barbed wire at the top. The men used their nifty tools to cut through both of those 2 fences, where they then ran, dragging their raft behind them down the hill to the water. And they'd managed to do all of this with guards in the guard tower standing watch. But I guess it's important to note that by the time these 3 men managed to escape the prison, the 6 guard towers had been closed and there were only 4 that operated, and even then, some of those 4 towers weren't manned 24 hours a day. And then the floodlights outside of the prison were dimmed down pretty low at the end of every night, after the last head count was done, and this was done because most of the staff and their families, along with the warden and his family, all lived on the island. The floodlights would have interrupted the staff and family's sleep every night. So these 3 men had made it all the way to the water, where they were able to toss their raft in and make their way off of Alcatraz Island for good. But what the 3 men didn't know was that by the time they'd made it to the water and gotten their raft inside the water and headed out, Alan West had actually made it out of his cell. But by the time that Alan West made it to the roof, the other 3 men had been long gone off the island. Alan West claims that he did wait on the roof until right before daybreak before he just returned to his cell. But the 3 men had left the smaller raft and a boat paddle behind for Alan West, so I don't know if he just didn't want to take a chance by himself, or if the smaller raft maybe wasn't, as well constructed, or, I don't really understand what reason he had for not going ahead and going, but he didn't. He just went back to his cell and he waited for head count that morning. And about 7 a.m. the next morning, the alarms were sounded to wake the inmates up to let them know that it was time for the first cell count. Once all the inmates were lined up for the first head count of the day, Bill Long, who was a guard at Alcatraz, walked, each row in each cell until he got to Frank Morris's cell. He saw that Frank was still asleep in his bed, and the way that the cells were kind of laid out was that the beds were up against the right side of the wall, and the inmate's head would have been at the front of the cell where the bars opened up at. So the pillows to the bed would have been, right behind the bars where the cell doors opened. And once this prison guard poked the pillow on Frank's bed, kind of just like gesturing him to wake up, he was shocked when it looked like Frank's head just rolled right off the bed and fell into the floor. After he realized this wasn't actually an inmate's head, though, he also realized that meant that Frank Morris wasn't in his cell. And it only took a few quick glances around to see that John and Clarence Anglin were also not in their cells. So the alarms were sounded, and the search for Frank Morris and John and Clarence Anglin started immediately. Now, obviously, the guards are going to do a sweep of everybody's cell after a prison escape, and it wasn't long before Alan West had some explaining to do as to why he also had a massive-ass hole in his cell wall, being hid behind a cardboard vent covered with paint to match the walls of his cell. So, even though Alan West was still technically in his cell, he did also have a huge hole in his cell, just like the ones that they'd found in Frank Morris's cell and the Anglin brothers' cell. And Alan couldn't even really play dumb at this point, because he did still have this massive hole in the wall in his cell. So Alan just had to admit that he was supposed to have gone with the 3 men when they escaped, but that he wasn't able to get through the hole in the wall in time to leave with them. Alan gave the officers as much information as he could without blowing the cover of the other 3 men, and Alan West also tried to hold back some crucial information just in case somebody one day down the road might also want to try to use this same escape plan. Because I guess there actually is honor among thieves. But not a single other inmate spoke a solitary word about the escape to the officers investigating it. Even though almost all of the other inmates knew about the escape, none of them said anything tying them to the escape plan directly, or even have a knowledge of it. They just didn't say a word. Now, once guards and officers started searching the water surrounding Alcatraz Island and all the caves and the little hideaway spots on the island, they never found a single trace of any of the 3 men that escaped that night. The waters were searched by boat, and there wasn't even sign of any bodies that had floated up to the surface either. There were a few things found, though, and people kind of speculate that maybe the men had left those things out to be found on purpose, and I'll make that make a little more sense in just a minute. So obviously the FBI was called in to help with this investigation when nothing was found, searching by foot, by sea, or by air. And as soon as the FBI arrived at Alcatraz prison to help aid in the search, one of the very first things the FBI wanted to know was why in the hell were there more than 50 big-ass blankets hanging up and blocking off the top of the cell blocks? Because that is important information. And it wasn't until the FBI started asking questions about this wall of blankets that all the tools, power tools, paint, and raincoat scraps were finally found behind the blanket wall. But it was after all of these tools and things that were found that the FBI was able to kind of piece together what they believed happened on the night of the escape. And this is when the second raft was found, along with the life jacket and the paddle that the other 3 men had left behind for Alan West. Which, again, kind of makes me question why Alan didn't at least try to escape on his own after he realized that the other 3 men had already gone without him. I don't know for sure, but I have a little bit of a theory that I'll touch on later, but for whatever reason he didn't go on his own, because remember, all 3 of the men had like a 10-hour head start before anyone even knew they escaped. So why wouldn't Alan West just have hopped on the smaller raft and taken off too? It wasn't really believed that the 3 men could have made it to shore using a raft made of raincoats, but no bodies had ever been found, which made the investigators believe that maybe, just by some miracle, the 3 men did actually make it to shore that night. Frank Morris and John and Clarence Anglin's faces were plastered all over the media to be on the lookout for that they were escaped from prison. Now, a few days after the escape, there were a few clues that were found in the case. It was 2 days after the escape when the paddle that the 3 men had used to drive the raft was found just off of Angel Island. Angel Island is only about 2.5 miles from Alcatraz Island, and there was no guessing that it was the same paddle because the men had also left an identical paddle for Alan West. So the paddle that was found and the paddle that was left for Alan West were basically identical. Had to have been theirs. And the only other thing that was found was a packet of pictures of the Anglin family that had been stored in a makeshift laminated type of thing that had been fashioned out of prison issue raincoats too. Now, FBI and investigators don't think that John and Clarence Anglin would have purposely left their family pictures behind, especially if they planned to be on the run and never be able to see their families again, but I beg to differ. I think those pictures were left behind on purpose to give off the illusion that the men had drowned and died. And then maybe, just maybe, everybody would stop looking for them. So after this discovery, it was said that the 3 men must have drowned and died during the escape that night, and the pictures were proof of that. But there are lots of people who don't believe this, even for a minute, including the rest of the Anglin family. And even the Anglin family believed that the brothers had tossed those pictures on purpose just to throw off the investigation. And eventually, all 3 of the life jackets that the men had used to escape that night had also been found. And even though the life jackets had been found, the 3 bodies of the 3 men never were. And the FBI would spend the next 15 years and onward looking for Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers. And with this case, it seems like you either fall into 2 camps. You either think that the men all drowned and died that night and that their bodies were eventually just washed out into the ocean, which would explain why their bodies were never found, or you believe that the men made it out alive and that they managed to live the rest of their lives without so much as even a traffic ticket after they made the escape that night. And I wholeheartedly believe that these 3 men made it out alive the night of their escape, and I'll tell you why. Because for years and years and years after the escape, the FBI and anybody else who was investigating this escape watched the families of the Anglin brothers pretty closely, looking for signs of communications with the brothers. Now remember, Frank Morris didn't really have family to begin with, so he wouldn't have been able to reach out to anybody besides maybe some friends. But one question that plagues me is, why are the FBI wasting funds to keep an eye on a family if they believe all 3 of these men died in the escape? Why are we wasting resources to try to track down supposedly dead men? Even the FBI themselves has said more than once that most of the time when a body is lost in this specific area that they always wash up to shore and are later able to be identified. But some people believe that another inmate from inside the prison, aka maybe a Bob Moss with lots of money and powerful connections on the outside, may have arranged for a boat to meet and pick the three men up after the escape to help them kind of get away. Which, if this boat theory is true, then that might be why Alan West never attempted to leave on his own that night. Because if he knew that there was a boat that was supposed to be meeting them, then it wouldn't really have done him much good to leave way later than expected and miss the boat that would have gotten him out of the country, before anybody ever even knew they were missing. And since Alan West ended up kind of helping police piece together how the men got out that night, they did agree not to tack on any more extra charges or time for the escaped attempt. So that actually makes sense if there was a boat as to why Alan West wouldn't have left on his own. Another reason I think that the three men made it out alive that night is because there are police records that weren't brought to light to the public until decades after the escape that say that even though boats were prohibited from being within X number of yards from the prison, that the night of the escape, there was an unknown boat that was spotted by an off-duty police officer at about 1 a.m. 1 a.m. would have been way before anybody knew that these men had escaped and were on the run. Now, according to this report, the interior lights on the boat were off, and the boat was just kind of sitting idle for about a half an hour. Then the off-duty officer claims to have seen somebody from inside the boat shining a flashlight into the water outside of the boat. Before the boat turned back on, the interior lights come on, and the boat took off shortly after. So if somebody had set this boat up to meet them, then it would make sense for them to be shining their flashlights down into the water to help the men out of the raft and onto the boat before the boat turned back on and then left with the interior lights on. And this boat was in between Alcatraz Island and Angel Island, and this was on the same night that the men escaped, but like I said, this wasn't actually brought to the public's attention until way later in the investigation, long after the escape. So people believe that the men either went to Brazil because at the time there was no extradition, or that maybe they went to Mexico. And it's known for a fact that all three of the men were either already fluent in Spanish, or that they were trying to teach themselves Spanish using books from the prison library. One of the biggest reasons that I'm convinced that all three of these men lived through the escape is that the Anglin brothers' mom would get unmarked and anonymous birthday cards, Christmas cards, and Mother's Day cards. And if she didn't get these cards that were always anonymous, then she would receive 2 dozen roses anonymously instead. Not 1 dozen, but 2. Almost like both of her sons wanted to be able to wish her a happy birthday or happy Mother's Day or whatever. Another thing that stands out is that when the Anglin brothers' mom passed away, there were 2 extremely tall women wearing wigs and extremely thick makeup who showed up at the funeral that nobody at the funeral knew. The FBI also attended the funeral because, we're still searching for dead men apparently. But these 2 unknown women came to the funeral, didn't speak a word to anybody, wept over the casket, and were gone before anybody was able to question them. The Anglin brothers' father also passed away, and again, 2 unknown men with thick beards showed up. They cried over the casket and they left abruptly. No one in the family claimed to have known these 2 people at either funeral, and you cannot convince me that this wasn't the Anglin brothers coming back to show their respects for their parents for the very last time. And this would have been long before 9/11, so airport security would have been nothing to get through. You'd need a fake ID and you'd just get through on the plane, and then you'd be back in Brazil like that. Now, another super interesting thing is that an old childhood friend of the Anglin brothers claims to have ran into them both in Brazil, and the Anglin brothers even let him get a picture of the 2 men together with the promise that this old childhood friend would give this picture to their parents. So I'm assuming this was before their parents passed away, obviously. And this picture is supposedly the Anglin brothers in Brazil. And it's been analyzed numerous times, and it's either a 99% match or it's inconclusive literally every time. But years later, a team shooting a TV show more recently did go to Brazil where the Anglin brothers supposedly put down roots. And there were tons of old-timers in the area who would have lived there at the time that the Anglin brothers would have showed up, who distinctly remember 2 American men showing up at about the same time that prison escape happened. Those same people shooting the TV show, which I'll have to find the name of it so I can link it in the description for you, but those same people shooting that TV show went to the spot where it was believed that the Anglin brothers lived And they did find an American penny and a few other pretty cool artifacts that would have only come from America either around or before the same time frame that the Anglin brothers would have left America. And the last thing I'll leave you with is this. There was a note that was sent to the San Francisco Police Department in 2013, and the writer claimed to be John Anglin. The letter goes on to say that all three of the men made it out of Alcatraz Island that night, and that by 2013, when the letter was written, that both Frank Morris and Clarence Anglin had both passed away and that they'd both lived long into the old age. The writer also claimed that he was John Anglin and says that he has cancer. The writer agrees to tell police where he is if they agree that he would spend no more than 1 year in prison and that he would also get medical care. The writer of the note told the San Francisco police to publish the letter if they wanted to make a deal and that he would write back and let them know exactly where he was. Strangely, this letter wasn't even known to the public until many years later in 2018. Now, the handwriting has been ran against samples of John Anglin's handwriting, but every time it's been looked at, the findings have been inconclusive. So what do you think? Because I truly think that they made it to Brazil or Mexico and they lived their best life. I really do. I think that no one wants to say that Alcatraz wasn't actually escape-proof, and they hate to admit that a couple of bank robbers were able to dupe the quote-unquote most secure prison in America. Although I still can't figure out why the FBI still to this day has an open case on all three of these men. Like, from my understanding, that case won't officially be closed until all three of the men's 100th birthday. And I'll leave you with one last fun fact. The papier-mâché heads that John and Clarence Anglin made for their cells, they named their mask Oink and Oscar. And I'm going to leave you with that. I really want to know what y'all think. I'm going to link the pictures and the articles. And I'll try to find the name of that TV show. But I think that's all I have for you this week. Patreon, I'll got you Friday. Let's do it again. Same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.